So the theme of the conference, you'll remember, is lifting vision and creating value. So how much value is there in value capture, and how do we capture it? Well, we've got PwC on the case. So to tackle this, please welcome John Marinopoulos from PwC Australia.
Thanks very much, one and all. I think the microphone's working here, so that's okay. And thanks, Shane. It's really good to see in terms of where Auckland Transport is now moving forward with a lot of its plans. And I think what I will talk about today in terms of the value of value capture will also then go and support where the next stage of hopefully ATAP 3.0 might take us. So, a couple of key points. One of the things that we've realised today from all the people we've been talking about, investment in transport creates a broad range of benefits. There's no doubt about that, and we've seen that in many different places around the world as well. In terms of many of the benefits, they flow through an uplift in land and also property values, but not only that, they flow to other beneficiaries as well, and we'll detail some of those as we go through that discussion. The changes in values are a consequence of the investment in transport and influenced by a number of factors. They are proximity to infrastructure, existing infrastructure base that might be around there as well as what are the competing alternatives. An interesting stat about Auckland, and I'll be addressed in terms of the exact proportion, is that we've seen from afar that, say, compared to Melbourne, there's twice as many people in Melbourne using public transport. Melbourne's about 6% or so of travel, but places like London are at 21%, and therefore it makes a total different equation in terms of the proximity of other transport around it. And the value that can be captured is a subset of the value created. It's a term that a number of people are starting to use now, we've been really focusing on for a long time. You've got to create it to capture it. And I think first and foremost, we've seen from what Auckland Transport's been doing, all the other agencies, Auckland Council, Housing New Zealand, New Zealand Government, most of the initiatives are all, if not all of them, are all about creating the value. Now it's how can we look at it in an equitable way to be able to capture that. But first and foremost, I want to be able to touch on one key point that Shane quite well brought up, and that is what we focus on. It says before value capture, before value creation or any of these things, you need to focus on these four things. And I'm just going to point up to what's in box number 1 up there, and that's the service need. Now, road deaths and injuries, congestion, critical. So let's focus on the service need first, rather than focusing on the dollars and the value, and how much value we're going to get from uplift or others. Our view is that you should really focus on the service need and the costs and risks, then start understanding the value creation and new funding, and what are the community and the beneficiaries, and what's the benefit to those or those people. And then iterate. Go back to 1. Have a look at what other solutions we can put in place. Are we meeting those particular service needs of the day? We've actually found that by using this iterative procedure, the type of delivery that actually occurs is much better. We found solutions where new types of infrastructure that people have thought which was the lowest cost is not the best value, but it's also not the best benefit to the people that actually need the particular infrastructure as well. So why are we talking about value capture? Really what we really want to do with many of these projects is we want to talk about project optimisation. In Victoria, in Australia, the new guidelines for value creation and value capture are about to be released. And these are very much talking about understand that the projects that are delivered, whether it's a precinct or it's actually focused on a broader range of capital infrastructure, has to actually then have optimisation, and it has to have integrated solutions rather than just the one solution in place. A good example you've seen in many places are level crossings. They just want to go off and put the level crossing in, but they don't think about all the other opportunities that can happen around that, whether it can be commercial, mixed use, or looking at other infrastructure that can be delivered as well. We've got to bridge the funding gap. There's no doubt about it. Everywhere that I go around the world, this is a conversation, whether it's going to be in Malaysia or Singapore or London, America, India, where there's a very tight legislation around this, Australia, South Africa, for water resources especially. Bridging the funding gap is a critical component. This is the conversation we're having now, is a conversation happening at every place in the world. Infrastructure investment has to create a range of value for beneficiaries, not just the users. And in fact, this is an area because it brings a new capital of how you can actually drive that value forward. And of course, one of the areas that I'm really focused on is how do we make sure that we can start making the private sector participate in these particular types of infrastructure. We've had cases in Australia where the private sector has decided to actually fund its own road bridges and give them back to government, and been able to evaluate the amount of value created and captured for them, and it's been substantial, 20 times or more. So these are areas to be able to think about, and there's more details we can provide about that. So when we talk about value capture, I think that one of the problems is a lot of people are talking about land only. We really want to make sure people understand that it's the investment in infrastructure has got these broad range of benefits. It's the improved access to transport networks and other amenities. It's the improved labour force accessibility. It's making sure that we've got access to services such as retail, hospitals, health, educational services, different schools, different universities, wetlands, multiple other different opportunities. Reduced travel times and other transport benefits. Then on top of that, what we do is we focus on the beneficiaries. Who's actually going to go off and be benefiting? The problem is we keep on pinning it down to developers and landowners, but really the benefits are the homeowners, landowners, employers, existing businesses, new businesses, investors, developers, local and central governments, and also in terms of the road and public transport users. By considering all those beneficiaries, and I'll show a framework we use, it's very important. And then the broad range of mechanisms. I know there's legislative restrictions in terms of councils compared to what the federal government or the central government can do here. But we look at a broad range of those mechanisms, as you can see there, from the differential ratings we're talking about, targeted rates. In Australia, we can do stamp duty, ticket levies, user charges, developer charges, property rezoning, proceeds of sale, and then it also goes to things such as land redistribution and other areas you can focus on, and air rights, of course. So the conditions for value capture are very important. You've got to be able to find the linkage between the relationship of the opportunity of what you're delivering, and that could be the transport initiative, it could be a housing initiative, it could be a health initiative, it could be a social initiative, and the benefit and the beneficiary. We actually have a number of projects where we've had 400 different type of opportunities that might be added into a project across a whole range or a whole precinct. We want to focus on what value is being created. That's very important. If you can understand what value is being created for all those different beneficiaries by beneficiary, it actually allows you to understand the willingness and the capacity to pay or participate in terms of how you can actually focus. That's why you need accurate and robust methodologies to make sure that they're able to be, firstly, emulated in other areas, but also can then be used for funding. The mechanisms, we actually all look at these and say that the valid legal instruments, try to keep to legislated instruments of the day. I couldn't believe it. I was alerted to one of the politicians in Victoria that we've had a betterment levy in Victoria from 1925. And then on top of that, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was actually paid partly by value capture because there was a proximity levy to the people on the North Shore in 1931. It was great to hear that. And of course, the timing of the contribution has got to be matched to when beneficiaries realise the value. This is vitally important. The problem is sometimes we alert people too late to the project, value's been realised, or we come back and we have a stock and flow issue where we might say, hey, you know what, we'll go off and have a mechanism that means you pay now but you can't afford it. So we've got to ensure that they're fully aligned. So value capture has been used, I've given a couple of examples in Australia, but don't think it's just here. It's many, many places around the world. We have about 30 to 40 case studies specifically we've worked on. And some of the ones we've talked about here, Crossrail is about 32% of the cost has been captured by value capture. And there's other places in Melbourne, we have high proportions. We've had ones from a long time ago, Gold Coast, Tokyo, there's land distribution, Sao Paulo, there's bond structures where people can actually go off and sell parcels of land to developers and they actually get the funds back initially. There's transport infrastructure funding that tax increment financing that we're finding in various places in America as well. And we've just come back from doing a lot of the work in Malaysia on, unfortunately, the hopefully stalled high-speed rail between KL and Singapore. We'll see what happens with that. But many of these case studies are available. You can have a chat with us, but really, it's good to be able to understand exactly that this is a broad church now. It's not just individuals and people that are taking a bold decision. So the opportunities for value creation and value capture. What we found is with Treasury officials in many different governments and Ministry of Finance, this chart has actually started to make a significant difference to the way they understand where value is ascribed. What we actually focus on is firstly the pink area, general value. We've heard the Auckland's gone up 100% in the last 10 years or so. It's like many other markets around the world that might not have gone up that much. I know my hometown of Melbourne in Australia has gone up by about 70 to 80% over about the last 8 years as well. But what happens is general value is going to grow, markets are going to grow. Melbourne's expected to be 8 million people by 2043 from 5 million that it is now. The user value is the economic basis. What are people using? What are the ticketing and the uplift? Then it's the beneficiary value. All those different beneficiaries we talked about, that extra value, we're looking at this as new capital that's coming into the system, not part of consolidated revenue, and value that can be ascribed that doesn't actually go into hypothecated but can be used for new outcomes. So new capital coming in is vitally important, and if we can tap that new capital from other markets, pension funds or others, it'll actually aid and add value back into the community. The process we take is we don't just focus on, hey, here's a mechanism, there's $1, find out what the number is, and here's the cost. We really say this has got to be an integrated process. Understand what it means from a planning perspective. Firstly, know your scope, know what you're actually going off and focusing in terms of what you can plan for those value outcomes. Find out the initiatives that will create the value for that community across all different beneficiaries. Understand what value can be captured, which is a subset, and I'll show you a value curve in a second. And also then understand how you're going to implement that. That means to either monetize and or securitize those revenue streams so they can potentially be off your balance sheet, but at least you know that you can monetize them so value can come back earlier into the process. And that value could be used for either the current project, other projects in the area, or in terms of a broader basis. So how the value approach considers potential revenue streams. Each of these lines across is a revenue stream. So for an opportunity, it doesn't just have one benefit or one beneficiary. It can have multiple benefits, multiple beneficiaries in multiple locations, an amount of value created and a mechanism to get value captured. An example is a new light rail stop. It might be an increased amenity for properties. For residential property owners, a location of the amenity of property, change in the property value, and might be stamp duty or whichever will be a targeted rate. But each of these lines across is an actual revenue stream. And what we do is we focus on understanding how many different opportunities there are, then how many different benefits there are, how many beneficiaries there are, and the mechanisms. And each of those then gives greater types of revenues and value uplift that you can actually utilise. The reason why we actually focus on this type of robustness in terms of looking at all those different revenue streams is you can actually see it in that top chart. So that's London Crossrail, a number of published uplifts in terms of property. So the first thing I want to highlight is from 1%, 9%, 46%, 73%, 45%, there's many different areas and many different uplifts that you actually have. One of the hardest parts is if you have a blanket number that's non-specific to the localised areas, you'll have some winners and some losers. And this is actually where we find it would decrease the reliability of the revenue streams. What we also have, so the predictive capability of the revenues is vitally important, and that's because, as if there are economists in the room here, it's the counterfactual analysis. If I actually impart revenue or capital into an area, did I receive that uplift that was predicted? And the specificity of that uplift is going to make a big difference in terms of the type of levels of value that you can actually capture. Fitch Ratings of an automated valuation models assessment, which actually shows the type of levels that banks use in terms of automated valuation for properties. That's the sort of level of rigour that we need to have when we're looking at using this for funding and financing to be able to get the uplift. We advocate about plus or minus 5% in terms of the predictability. Fitch, I think, says plus or minus 20, but that's probably okay in valuations because they already take the 20% off if you're in banking. But we really think it's very important to be able to be very predictive in terms of the uplift. So the way they actually calculate the uplift, and we've been using these for a long time, we used these originally for property pricing specifically, but now we use to understand infrastructure value that comes back, is we have these curves. And the first one is the value curve of distance away from different change of value in property from an amenity. It could be a train, a light rail, it could be looking at different things such as a hospital, doctors' clinics, retail or others. And really, this top value curve is very important because what it does, it actually goes off and focuses on the type of value created. This comes from a lot of reveal preference modelling that you'd actually have. So it's actually proxy for willingness to pay, and also gives you an idea of the capacity to pay as well because you can understand the socio-economic basis of the individuals. So you can segment this down to different markets, different sub-segments, and the area, the geography, to be able to understand what the uplift is. The reason why we've got this, and really it's made up of multiple types of mechanisms that you could have through here, is that a subset should be value captured, not all of it. And also, not like you find in a lot of other areas where they might have a blanket number that goes all the way across. Something like Gold Coast in Australia has a blanket revenue number that says for the light rail that's only right near the coast, even for people that are 30 kilometres away, they pay the same per property as they do for right next to the actual rail line. So we believe that the targeted rate should start using curves like this. Now, one of the things I said before is what infrastructure is present. If you actually are closer to a piece of, or further away from a piece of infrastructure now than you were before, yes, that's maybe these curves are appropriate. But this allows you to understand how much extra benefit is coming from that particular type of infrastructure. And that's where you can actually make sure you get much tighter predictions. So the reliability of the revenue collection increases, the checks and balances of the impact on each of the different segments increases. Here is where complexity builds precision. And it's very important to be able to understand then the direct impact on, firstly, who can afford it and when they can afford it and how much value you can get. So, of course, the last point was, why did we actually come to this point? How much value is there in value capture? This is not a theoretical chart. This is actually the chart we've seen over about 80 different projects around the world. And these numbers actually are factual. The problem is we see a lot of projects, people come up to it afterwards as an afterthought and say, hey, I need to do a value capture. And the problem is it's really, the horse is bolted. You get very little value and most people say, it doesn't work. On some other projects we've had where we've been in right at the start of that project, where it's very silent, we understand what the uplift's going to be, how much we can get out as benefit, we've been up to this level and plus. Some of them have been up to about 60%. So realistically, the issue in terms of how much value in value capture comes from these two drivers. Are you aligning the value capture within a broader context so you can actually have them as highly integrated compared to no integration? And also the timing of integration into the business case. Is it early or is it late? The key measure out of this is get in early. Really focus on the actual original process, the optimisation of those projects, what's the service need, what do we need to deliver, let's iterate. This also starts lending to one of the other issues that's very important, and that is optimisation of the portfolio of delivery. Every agency here's got a portfolio of delivery. The government's got a portfolio of delivery. It's important to start thinking of how that integrates together so you can move in aggregate further up the chain up here. Of course, value capture, one of the key points is, and I don't know why that's off, and it's probably because I turned it off, value capture, the actual dollars captured can be apportioned to many different things, not just the project. They could be apportioned to the public transport, the investment in public amenities, the OPEX of the extra transport, transit-oriented developments that we've seen in other areas, broader urban renewal projects as well. In Malaysia, they're very focused on the transport-oriented developments today that they need. Just to give you an idea, and this is public knowledge, not private knowledge, the public transport operator, similar to Auckland Transport in Malaysia, owes currently $9 billion, and they might lose their government support. And so they've now got to work out where do we get the money to be able to pay all that back. And they've got to focus on similar sort of capex that you've got here as well. So just finishing off, of course, and I'll be very quickly because I've got about 2 minutes to go. Value capture, firstly, has got a long-established history globally. There is going to be a trade-off between equity and complexity. What I showed you before, those value curves, do take a bit of work, but they actually are very, very precise. The problem is a lot of people say, just give me the answer today. I need the answer. So you've got to be able to trade off what you do. But the thing is, just getting the answer means you might have an inequitous outcome. The mechanisms should attempt to look at existing legislation and collection systems. It's amazing what you do when you go through legislation, you find out how many different types of value capture mechanisms there are actually existing. Going back to the Malaysian example, we found out that there was something in 1974 that allowed basically betterment levies to be ascribed across the whole of KL. The value capture revenue streams need to be highly reliable and predictive to be able to make sure they can give sufficient comfort to lenders, ministries of finance, treasury, and others to be able to get those outcomes. Point 4 is really important. We can't limit economic growth. You know, when we go off, and a great example of that is donut effects that are occurring, where people sit around and say, oh, let's just put a blanket number, and you find that there's value or properties that occur right at the centre of a particular piece of infrastructure, and then as soon as the area in which the actual charge stops, then developments are occurring around there. We've got to get away from those. The objective and use of value capture has got to be focused on the context of each of the particular areas. What you're going to do in Papakura is different to K Road, which is different to Takapuna, which is going to be different to Wellington, which is different to Palmerston North. Focus and make them specific to each area. And also the value creation often requires upfront capital investment. Value creation is really important. It's vital. You've got to create value to capture it. So it means that a lot of those public works and others are going to be part of that. I mean, we've had some of the infrastructure projects which are probably have double the amount of value creation exercises compared to the actual delivery of the project. So I've got to go because I've just been dinged. The last slide is very much important, and this is actually one of the biggest changes we've seen that we found ministries of transport everywhere around the world are really working with us. They've gone away from cost-benefit ratios, which are about benefit over project cost, to benefit plus value created. And that, I know some of the economists in the room are going to say, that's not what we see in our BCRs, et cetera, but we found this has really gelled well with many treasuries and finance departments because they start understanding that it's the other beneficiaries above the users that are not now webs or second-order effects, they're first-order effects. You've got to incorporate all those. They start changing all the BCRs and all your projects, how you work together. So as I said, value capture can help in many cases to fund at least 30%, and so therefore, but you've got to be early in the process and you've got to be integrated. One size fits all will limit value capture. Be specific in your areas and what you want to focus on. And of course, the last line's a plug for us, but that's okay, I'll leave that alone. Thanks very much. Yes, of course.
So we'll just take the top question for John. Can you comment on capturing non-financial, environmental, social and cultural value, which is more difficult to monetise and securitise?
Absolutely it is, and I'll be quite quick about this because I could probably talk for 10 minutes on that, and I won't because you'll kill me. Realistically, we look at this and say we need to understand exactly what the direct impact is on each of the beneficiaries and each of the benefits they get. There will be some that we have which are non-monetary. It could be a broader base in terms of the lifestyle that people have within those areas. What we do is we advocate to undertake specific studies of what choices and what willingness to pay they have for some of those benefits. There are, I'll give you an example, gated communities. People are willing to pay for some of those benefits of having that infrastructure. Wetlands, we know that actually impacts property value. So it's important to be able to understand what of those, if there's a willingness and capacity to pay. So the best thing I'd say is study it, and you can actually do the type of choice models to get those value curves. If there's no willingness to pay for those, take it away, but otherwise you can start looking at how you can work with your constituents to be able to see what uplift you can get.
Wonderful, succinct answer. Please put your hands together for John.
Thank you.